Okay, well, this morning's session is asking all about the nones. Who are the nones? What's churning under the surface for people who have pivoted away from organized religion? Where do they come from? What are some of the historical forces? Who are the nones and what's going on? Where are they going? What do pollsters sometimes miss when they describe this group that, as you know, reflects 29% of the United States population today? Perhaps unfathomable a couple of generations, a couple of decades ago. And look, we've got just the right speakers for you. We have Professor Richard Parker from Harvard and Professor Diane Winston from USC. They're deeply schooled in some of this. They've published books on some of this. Full disclosure, Eugene's taking a journalist call right now, but Richard Parker was his professor at the Kennedy School. Richard Parker was my professor at the Kennedy School in 2002 and 2003, and when I worked for him as a TA in the only class that has religion in the title at the Kennedy School, Religion, Politics, and Public Policy in the United States, a class that involves site visits to perhaps as many as 8 or 9 different congregations in Boston. Anyway, we got the right speakers to dive into this topic. You've got their bios in your program, so I won't go on and on. Diane previously worked at the Pew Charitable Trust on religion. She was a journalist who covered religion at Raleigh News and Observer, at the Dallas Times-Herald, at the Baltimore Sun. She has an MTS from Harvard Div School, a journalism degree from Columbia, a PhD from Princeton, and she's written quite a lot on the subject of sort of religion, media, politics, American history, and how they sort of intersect and overlap. Richard earned an Oxford PhD in economics. He's taught at the Kennedy School since 1993. His biography, his intellectual biography of John Kenneth Galbraith, earned a number of awards from Farrar Straus. He is the co-founder of Greenpeace, and he is the founder of Mother Jones, which is a pretty unique pair of accolades in terms of life accomplishment. His wife has Jewish and Catholic roots, and I mentioned his class. How does media shape our religious experiences, especially for an online rising generation? How's Christian nationalism in play? We asked this in the topic description that you've seen, particularly in the last decade, sort of filling a bit of a spiritual void. How does our politics in both parties shape the spiritual attitudes and behavior of those who have pivoted away from organized religion? And then we'll go to you, okay? And when we go to you, if you wouldn't mind, we have a number of people here for the first time. Just put up your table tent like this, and we'll get you in a queue. The mics are brand new because we've never been here before, but just hit the button with a little person on it. It turns red, and then you'll be on. And then after you've asked your question, if you wouldn't mind hitting it again so the next person's freed up. Welcome, Richard. Welcome, Diane. We're going to go, I think, from your right to left as we start up, and we'll flip to you in about 45 minutes or so. Richard Parker, welcome to Faith Angle.
Thank you, Josh. Well, first of all, I'm delighted to be here. I'm delighted to be here with this group because there are not only 2 of my former students, but a couple of my auditors as well, too. So I think I'm up to a 4 or maybe a 5 count of people who have heard me talk at least once. I'm also delighted to be sitting next to Diane Winston, whose work I've long admired, and this is my first time chance to meet with her, and so I'm delighted that we're doing this panel together. I'm also delighted to see Dave Campbell here because his work with my colleague Bob Putnam has been very influential in my thinking about a lot of this, and you'll see how in just a few minutes. I'm a traditional teacher, and that means what I'm going to do is I will summarize what I'm about to say it, and then summarize it a second time, because I always found that it was best to not count on the students actually understanding or listening to what you were saying when you were actually doing the talk. It reached a kind of crisis point when laptops were prolific in classrooms, and I finally banned them in mine because my TAs found that students were sitting and booking their vacations or ordering clothing while I was lecturing. I thought that was just a little too much. I didn't mind that they did it. I'm absolutely in favor of individual choice, but they were distracting other students who thought, no, the purple one is much better. I go, no, we can't have a class like that. Let me also, before I start, say something about who I am, because I think one of the benefits of this conversation, hopefully, will be that some of who we are will surface in a way that's authentic and can make the conversation richer, at least I hope so. The thing you need to understand about me is that I'm an economist, but my father was an Episcopal clergyman. And so I am deeply rooted in a tradition in the Episcopal Church that is associated with what is called the social gospel tradition in the church, and we can talk about that during the Q&A back and forth. I also come from the branch of the Episcopal Church that is known as the Low Church branch of the church, meaning we don't do bells and whistles. And a friend of mine once referred to my father as a Methodist with a sense of humor. I don't know if that's the correct description. My mother had another description of him, which was that, Richard, your father thought that the Holy Trinity was Father, Son, and Franklin Roosevelt. And I can unpack that because it actually tells an important story about his kind of church. The other thing I think I want you to understand is that I have been through cycles of faith and lack of faith, or loss of faith, or something else throughout my life. I'm in one of the non-faith periods of my life, and I can talk to you about why. But what you should understand is that as a clergyman's son, I was an acolyte, I was a member of the choir, I was the leader of the youth fellowship, I was the senior patrol leader and Eagle Scout of the troops of the church's scout troop. And so when I got to college and someone said, well, do you still go to church? I said, no, are you kidding? He said, why? And I said, because I've already done 30 years of church in the first 17 years of my life. So part of what we're going to discuss, I think, is the idea of familiarity with institutions as distinct with the idea of being religious. And I think that's very important for us to keep unpacked and discerned as we move through this. I think the other is to understand something very important about social science, and in particular polling, and the problems of polling inaccuracy based on the kinds of questions and the audience reached. We're now at a stage, and Diane will talk about this, I know, more, where in most cases, most phone polls are finding that their completion rates are on the order of 6, 7, or 8% of the initial contacts made, meaning 90% of the people who were reached in phone polls simply won't complete that poll. And there's been movement to internet-based polls, which have their own particular sorts of biases and problems, which means that when I look, as an economist trained to think about statistics and data, when I look at a lot of data about religion in America, I'm very, very cautious about assuming the accuracy of that data. And that's a condition of the way I think about data in quantitative terms as it's related to religion. So those are my prefaces. What I'm going to do is try to make a quick and summative argument about how it is that religion is important, why it's been particularly important in the American historical context right up to today. My purpose being to try to situate what we're living through now with the evolution of the role of religion socially and politically ever since the colonization process started 500 years ago. Then I'm going to shift quickly to a discussion of long cycles in American politics. And I'm going to do that by talking about someone who thinks about long presidential cycles, but I'm going to tie it to long religious cycles that go on, not perfectly in parallel, but enough so that you want to pay attention to what the coordination between presidential electoral politics and religious belief and who believes what are interacting with one another. And then I'm going to close with a brief discussion of Jürgen Habermas. For those of you who know who Habermas is, he was Adorno's assistant for many years and was quite influential in the so-called Frankfurt School, which was a post-World War II German intellectual Marxist study center, who in the last 30 years of his life became intensely more interested in the social role of religion, and actually carried on a long dialogue with Cardinal Ratzinger before Ratzinger became Pope, and came to a new understanding of why in what we think of as a secular age, the role of religion at its best remains vitally important for a healthy society and for a healthy humanity. So that's going to be a three-step process. I'm going to look at origins of religion and their role more generally. I'm going to use someone named Peter Berger to discuss that. I'm going to then talk about long presidential cycles and their relationship, my adapted discussion of their relationship to religion, and I'm going to use Stephen Skowronek And then finally, I'm going to close with Jürgen Habermas. So I will try to reserve 2 minutes for summarizing what I'm going to say over the next 15. But let me do my 15, all right? Questions, concerns before I get started?
It is recorded. You bet. Hit that button, will you, Kalpana?
Sorry, just wanted to know if we can record this.
You bet. We're on the record.
Thank you.
Good. So I've tried to understand religion as a social concept, as a basket of questions that human beings seem to have been asking one another and themselves now for literally tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of years. Their stories, probably most importantly, about the idea of death and of life, because every early human civilization or community's remnants that we find involve grave goods of one kind or another that seem to want to prepare the subject for something that comes after in a way that is very important to be honored in that person's burial. That leads to questions about the nature of life, which on one level become questions about roles, and in particular, identities that people take on in order to function. Peter Berger makes this very fundamental and important point using what he calls a dialectic form of what he calls a process of externalization, objectification, and internalization. Externalization, objectification, internalization. He emphasizes that we as creatures are born into the world naked as a species in terms of our relationship or understanding of the world that we encounter. And we are socialized by being given the gift of language, and with the gift of language, given the ability to differentiate and name that which we encounter. And we can think about naming a bottle, naming a cell phone. This was not particularly important in the Paleolithic, but I use it as an example. A piece of paper and the like. And identifying objects that we think of as material represents a whole set of questions that we can go into. But Berger wants to push us further and say, it also gives us the ability to use language to create relationships. They could be relationships of, I'm your father, you're my daughter, you're my cousin, you are part of my community, you are foreign to me, you are xenia in Greek terms. And each of those stories each of those namings carries with it a long moral tale of obligation and duties toward the stranger, toward the child, toward the community in one form or another. And what Berger says is that we need to think of that whole, that in some ways constructed whole that relies on language as its foundation, as what he calls the nomos. And he contrasts that with what he calls the cosmos, which is that physical world which exists outside us, that we can see in the stars, or that we can see in the moon, or that we can imagine when we stare out at the sea. But it's not just a material world that you're encountering. It's something that raises questions about the nature of that world, because there are forces operating in that world that can be both rewarding and terribly dangerous, terribly damaging. And what Berger argues is that religion emerges as a bridge between the nomos and the cosmos, a bridge between the nomos and the cosmos. When what we do when we engage in prayer, when we engage in other forms of ritual identification, is to try to speak in human terms to that which is a non-human power, which lies as a force beyond that which we see in the objective world that may constitute the stars or the mountains or the ocean and the like. And our ability to awaken and propitiate or to satisfy those forces is at the heart of what it means to do religion in social relations. Now, he then goes on and tries to offer a number of other observations that I don't want to spend too much time on right now. What I would emphasize is that it gives you a model so that the idea of externalization, objectification, And internalization is a process that a child passes through in maturing from infancy to childhood to adulthood, but that adults are constantly repeating as they encounter what is new or different in the world. Because the truth of the matter is, we use language and that nomos that we construct around us, that we inherit and we adapt and we manipulate, as a shield that protects us from the otherwise chaotic and unpredictable nature of the world as we might encounter it. And so one can see how, in a very important way, religion that I think of as a basket of these questions is trying to do the work of bridging the nomos and a cosmos in a way that is part of what stills our fear of being alive and stills our fear of being alone, when in fact those are on some levels the actual conditions under which we live. What we have to remember is that we can think in terms of time and space, but another category equally as important but not physical is memory and forgetting. And the very idea of being able to memorialize or to remember using the nomos where we are, who we're with, what the obligations are that we owe to one another, what we expect of them, what we can hope of them, is what gives us the stability to go forward on not just a large, lifelong, or a civilizational basis, but on an immediate, day-to-day, moment-by-moment basis as well, too. So there's my number one, which is I'm using Berger to try to emphasize why it is so very important that we recognize religion's fundamental social psychological role without affirming, because I teach at a university that wouldn't want me affirming, at least maybe at the Divinity School, but not so much at the Kennedy School, the existence or non-existence of the transcendent. The second theme that I want to address is from Stephen Skowronek, who's a terrific political theorist at Yale. And if you haven't read him, I really do commend him to you. He, in the 1990s, began to look at arguments about presidents and presidential power and why some presidents are transformative and others aren't. So now bear with me, I'm switching subject from religion and ontological and social relations to a specific discussion of American presidents and the idea of power and the idea of continuity and periods in power that I will then myself carry onto a relationship with American religion. What Skowronek says is, look, we've had nearly 4 dozen men be president, not quite, just a little short. Virtually every one of those comes into office thinking, I will be a transformative figure. I will put my stamp on the republic. I will bend America in the direction that I have been elected to bend it in and that I dream of bending it in because I have dreamed of being in this office for a long, long time. Every one of those fellows isn't entering the White House going, gee, I wonder what this will be like. This seems something new. I haven't tried this. They've sought out and keened for this kind of power. But what's quite obvious is only about half a dozen of those nearly 4 dozen look like they were actually transformative. That's the observable thing. You can get some disagreement about a couple of them, but I think that there are a few like Jefferson, Jackson, Lincoln, FDR, Reagan, who are pretty much in the camp of authentically agreed upon from all perspectives transformative figures. Now, what Skowronek says is, well, it's important to look at something very interesting, which is that there are time intervals between these transformers. They never come back to back or even within a decade or 2 decades of one another. There's always an elongated period. What's going on in that elongated period? Well, first, Skowronek says, look at what the transformer does in office, or actually in campaigning for office and then in holding office. He does 2 things. One, he assembles and stabilizes a coalition of voters and interest groups that are going to form the continuity that follows after him, that's going to leave the stamp of his transformation on subsequent presidents as well as on his own time in office. The second is that he finds a simplified rhetorical frame. It can be, I'm for the market, I'm for government that works. It's condensable into a bumper sticker in many cases. Morning in America, the only thing we have to fear is fear itself. What it does is it provides for large numbers of voters and for professional narrators, in particular journalists and academics, a means of recognizing what it is that is the organizing principle behind this transformers effort. So you get the assembly of the base, right? The bringing together of coalitions. Because remember, politics, presidential politics is always about finding and assembling coalitions. It's never the case that you've got 70 or 80 or 90% of Americans going, this is what I want. That's not true. You always have smaller groups, and the trick of a successful presidency is the ability to bring otherwise oftentimes unimaginable coalitions together and then hold them together. Think of Franklin Roosevelt. Franklin Roosevelt takes recent immigrant ethnic Americans north of the Mason-Dixon line and welds them into a party that consists south of the Mason-Dixon line of whites who are, by any test of our current use of the term, racist. And he pulls those two together in ways that produce the most important shift in the size and the scope of the federal government in history up to that point. And you would not have said, if you were a smart aleck Harvard professor in 1925, or you were a smart aleck Times reporter in 1925, that this was what was coming. Journalism and academics were not able to anticipate what was coming, and for a while didn't understand what Roosevelt represented. In some ways, Reagan faced the same in the 1970s. Reagan had surfaced earlier in 1964 as an advocate for Goldwater, and everybody confidently at Harvard and at the networks and at the Times and elsewhere thought, well, oh, he's just an actor. No one is ever going to elect an actor president. I mean, or someone from, we didn't even know the term, reality television. What would TV experience actually matter to the serious office of the presidency? So what you want to do is think then about, well, why these long intervals? One is that the force of the ideological narrative and the strength of the voter base, the voter coalition, hold, okay? But each of those cycles also has its own half-life, meaning it will run, but it will run out. The further you get away from the founder of the cycle, the less likely it is that his successors will be able to carry it out in ways that the original voting bloc, the original voting base, thought was viable, right? Or thought represented. So what do you get when you get Harry Truman? You get the absolute, but the first successor to the transformer. You get the absolute affirmation that I am his man. I am. He's the New Deal. I'm for the fair deal. Anything that Roosevelt said, I'm for. I'm Harry Truman. Anybody remember George H.W. Bush? Read my lips. No. This was an affirmation of a Yankee New England Republican saying that he was entirely in the political camp of this Southwestern Republican conservatism. It wasn't true. He knew it wasn't true, but he absolutely had to say it, just as it wasn't entirely true of Harry Truman that he was a devoted Rooseveltian. And there are thousands of monographs and hundreds of books devoted to that particular debate. David McCullough will try to convince you one way, others will try to convince you another. But the idea is that there's a series of patterns set in these long cycles. Now, what then comes along is that an opposition party president gets elected. So you go from Roosevelt to Truman, but then who comes after Truman? Suddenly it's Eisenhower, okay? But does Eisenhower turn out to be a Trumpian or Reagan conservative? I would submit that Eisenhower couldn't be nominated by this Republican Party. In fact, we know that Eisenhower, as late as 6 months before he accepted the Republican nomination, was weighing whether or not to run as a Democrat, right? So one point that is made by Skowronek looking at this is besides producing copycat attempts by immediate successors, when members of opposition parties enter the White House, no matter the fact that they may be opposition, they're constrained by the politics that the transformer has prescribed. So Roosevelt's Social Security, Roosevelt's pro-labor legislation, Roosevelt's social regulation, that's not overturned by Eisenhower. That's not even publicly challenged by Eisenhower. We go off in a different direction that's very important, which is that we enter a period of Cold War expansion of government, such that under Eisenhower, and really up until Johnson, half of a much larger federal budget is spent by the Pentagon. But this was not part of Roosevelt's plan or dream, but it was not also a refutation of those parts of the Roosevelt dream that survived into the Eisenhower and subsequent period. We have today Social Security because Eisenhower and Richard Nixon both took a look at it as opposition party presidents and said, oh no, I'm not going near that. I'm not touching that legacy of the FDR cycle. Well, what you want to understand is that we get to a place with these presidential cycles that require the emergence of a new challenger. They're fairly late in the time they appear. We've had two possibilities in the Reagan cycle, and Obama was one of them, and Joe Biden was the other. What Obama did was unfortunately not strong enough to break out of the conservatism of the financial market deregulation that had been associated with the Reagan era. And that left him vulnerable with a big part of his own political base, and it constrained him in terms of what he was able and willing to do. So, and as an economist, I'd be glad to talk at great length about that particular problem. The other was Joe Biden, who as a adult lifetime insider in Washington saw that the coalition base for Reaganism was deteriorating and that there was a moment of opportunity and that he, as a skilled in-house politician, knew how to assemble the leadership in the Congress, and he set about trying to assemble a base among voters, but failed, did not win that support, and then with his performance at the debate and then the way in which his successor was chosen as nominee, he failed twice more. And so what you have, I would argue right now, is a period in which what you see is the flopping around of the tail end of a Reagan conservative cycle, waiting for a new democratic turn to be born. We can talk about all this, but let me try and finish in the time I've got allotted. The third reason, the third author, Habermas, I raised because I think that he does something useful in terms of setting discussion for the nuns. He's clearly, in any measurable sense, starts out life as a young left-wing German social theorist, and who makes his reputation criticizing Heidegger and Heidegger's silence about Heidegger's supports for the Nazis. He's Adorno's assistant for a number of years, but as he works on the idea of communication and the idea that he comes to of communication as social action, he acquires a new respect for the role that religion plays in intermediating the relationship between individuals and the state and in constructing the foundational values of the state and the way that the state will function. And while he recognizes that a process of secularization is going on in Europe, because remember, this is Europe, and the process of secularization has proceeded much farther and much earlier there than here, what he recognizes is that religion at its best does something very important, which is to center the community on the idea of hope, an idea of hope as redemption that cannot be supplied either by the material benefits of the society alone or by the rhetoric that fails to speak to the values that are clustered around hope that religion can but doesn't always provide. Let me just try to emphasize, he sees in human life two aspects of freedom that I think are very important when we shift to talking specifically about the nuns and what they are looking for or think they're looking for. It's the intersubjectivity of autonomy, that people seek autonomy, people are burdened with autonomy, but don't fully understand that that autonomy is a condition of their intersubjectivity with other subject beings. And second, that it's the self-binding nature of the will in its arbitrary freedom. Because remember, we are creatures who can make mistakes. We are free to ignore. We are free to choose the wrong path. That arbitrary freedom to point ourselves toward unconditionally valid gnomic claims, what he would call the moral essence that religion is trying to point to. So I will now use 30 seconds.
Please.
What have I said to you? I've said, first of all, it's really important in setting up this discussion of the nuns is to situate it in the context that we're in today, asking what's going on in a larger political and social sense. I've said, by looking at 3 authors, you can see 3 important themes that I want to introduce into the conversation. The first is the way that religion serves as a bridge between the nomos and the cosmos, and the importance of recognizing that role, no matter what the religious tradition. Second, the idea that there are long cycles in American politics that we need to pay attention to, and I'll save my linkage directly to long periods in American religious life too, but I can pretty much do that. And then third, to try to use someone like Habermas, whom you would not think of as a defender of religion or bound to a religious tradition, which he wasn't, or particularly an advocate in defense of religion, who is able, as in some sense, a nun of a much higher quality intellectually, to think about the issues that nuns can use religion in dialogue for. That's my pitch. Thank you.
Thank you, Richard.
Thank you, Josh, and thank you, Abby, for bringing us all here today. And what a pleasure it is to be with so many interesting people at such a beautiful resort. I told my husband I could get used to this. And Richard, thank you. What an interesting partner you are, and how much I've enjoyed speaking to you these last few weeks, and how happy I am that you provided a commercial for my recent book, because my recent book, Writing the American Dream, How the Media Mainstreamed Reagan's Evangelical Vision, actually explains the role of the media in changing ideology in this country. Mm-hmm. So if you haven't read it, I suggest you do, and it really speaks to this idea of cyclical change. Unlike you, I see Trump as the next transformative president, mm-hmm. much as I hate to admit it, and I think in our small conversations we can all discuss what that means for politics and religion in this country. I had not expected to say anything about myself, but since you did, and I thought it was helpful, mm-hmm. I will say that I am the dire opposite of Richard. I grew up in New York City. I'm from an extremely secular family. What can I say about that? I went to Brandeis not realizing it was a Jewish school.
Did you think it was Baptist or what?
I thought it was co-ed, and after 6 years in an all-girls school,
That'll
that
do.
was my
There we go.
religion.
There we go.
I went to Israel for the first time to visit a friend, not because I had any interest in Israel or Zionism. And most people who I met there were appalled by my ignorance, both as a Jew and as a student of history. So I come to this from a very different place than you do, but I see we meet in the middle because I married an Episcopalian.
There we go.
Fortunately, he saw the light and converted. And we both share a deep interest in religion and politics.
So I have a Jewish wife, and so what I would say is this is the chosen and the frozen have come together.
And because it's sort of my job, I'm just going to tell a quick story about Brandeis University, where Diane went. Right before he died, the late Rabbi Jonathan Sachs spoke to a group of about 12 of you, maybe 2 of you were on that Zoom, and he said that the Brandeis rowing team was just getting crushed every race. And so they'd send their captain over to Harvard to take a look at how those guys were rowing. And is it any better? And what can we learn? The guy spends a whole day at the head of the Charles, sees all these boats going down the river, he's got binoculars, taking notes, and he comes back to Brandeis and he says, guys, they're doing everything opposite us. They have 8 guys doing the rowing and only 1 doing the talking.
Oh my God, that's great. Can I take that for future speeches? Thank you. Unfortunately, it's going to make my Jewish joke seem not quite as great, but I want to start with this old Jewish joke. A group of Jews is hotly debating the existence of God when one of them pauses. We need to stop arguing, she says. It's time for afternoon prayers. That, I guess you didn't get the joke. Should I deconstruct it?
Oh, I love that. That's so good.
That, in a nutshell, is what I want to focus on today. We have manufactured a split between the secular and the spiritual when they really coexist in the dance of life. And here's my provocation. Nuns is a made-up concept created by pollsters and adapted by journalists because it's an easy and titillating news hook. To prove my point about the interpenetration of the spiritual and the secular, I will start with 3 examples, all ripped from the headlines. I will go over some history with you and offer some concluding observations, and then I'll finally get to the nuns. The first example is Pope Leo's recent encyclical on AI. The encyclical calls us to center human dignity as we move forward with artificial intelligence. The Pope argues that this new technology, the current summit of scientific progress, demands a spiritual response. There is no division between the secular and the spiritual in this manifesto. Rather, it is a reminder that we live in a world where these two are intertwined, and what happens in one will always influence the other. The second example is from Israel. As you may know, Orthodox Jews, ultra-Orthodox Jews, have been exempt from military service. But the current crisis has brought an end to that dispensation, endangering Netanyahu's coalition. That's significant, but for our purposes, I want to call your attention to protests earlier this week by the ultra-Orthodox community against forced conscription. According to NPR, quote, protesters held signs condemning Israel and saying, "We would rather die as Jews than live as Zionists," and "We refuse to serve an army for the sake of the Zionist religion." Lastly, closer to home, the Presbyterian seminarian running for a Texas Senate seat, James Tallarico, has said that participating in our democracy is not only a civic duty, but a spiritual exercise, because voting and listening to different points of view builds empathy and community. He's also said that policies that assist the poor and welcome the stranger are truer to Jesus' teachings than those of the Christian right. I don't think my point could be any clearer. In the real world, the world we live in, there is no stark divide between sacred and secular. We live in a both-and continuum, and what we believe, whether or not we acknowledge it, shapes how we see ourselves, our community, and our world. There are very few nuns or nihilists existing today. Most of us have a reason for getting out of bed every morning. And once you recognize that, you understand that even how the most seemingly secular of reasons, money or sex, for starters, can be understood as religious. Now let's step back a minute and discuss why we think of the spiritual and the secular as separate realms. Historians use different stories to explain this, and here's mine. In the pre-modern world, people saw a difference between the temporal order and the spiritual one, but the two were intertwined. The supernatural was an obvious physical reality. A bad harvest meant God was angry, and summer rains demonstrated divine love. Kings ruled and peasants toiled because God ordained it. People existed in both temporal time, the cycle of their lives, but also in sacred times, the rituals and holy days that gave life meaning. This orientation changed over centuries for several reasons. And just to be clear, I'm now talking about the West. The first was in the 16th century with the Protestant Reformation. Reformers sought to end superstitious beliefs, removing spiritual enchantments from the material world. Okay, I am going to zip over history that could take up textbooks. So we can always come back to this, and I'm open to questions and sidebar conversations. Then the scientific revolution of the 17th century explained that the universe followed predictable mathematical and physical laws. God became the cosmic clockmaker who wound up the world and then retreated. In the 18th century, the Enlightenment applied the scientific method to society, politics, and morality. Reason, not revelation, should guide society. And the 19th century saw the rise of urbanization and industrialism. Nature and natural cycles gave ways to clocks and factory schedules. Local accountability was lost in large cities. Pluralism led many to doubt their personal religious beliefs, and new ideologies, Marxism, for example, offered cogent systems for making sense of the world. I'd add a fifth and more recent orientation, whether you call it market capitalism, hypercapitalism, neoliberalism, or late-stage capitalism, as another reason for the apparent gulf between the sacred and the secular, but I promised we would discuss this later.
Looking forward to it.
We will return to that. The bottom line is we live in a world where the spiritual and the secular seem like two different realms. And those of us who never go to religious services or don't identify with a religious tradition are called nuns. So let's stop for a minute and ask ourselves, what is religion? This is a question, if you ask a religion scholar, you will never get the same answer twice. Some will say religion is a personal conviction and that's it. Others will give you a song and dance about, Gertz, Assad, blah, 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 with their theoreticians. I'm going to say that, from my perspective, religion is an institution with shared beliefs, practices, and values that connect us, human beings, to a higher reality. In the West, these institutions are predominantly Christian, with sizable minorities, depending where you are, of Jews, Muslims, Hindus, and Buddhists. But when these systems began, they did not consider what we call religion to be a distinctive category separate from everyday life. Domains such as law, medicine, farming, and family were shot through with what we would call religious beliefs and practices, even though there was no word for religion in ancient Sanskrit, Hebrew, and classical Greek and Arabic. The interpenetration of the spiritual and the secular was simply the way things were. Our current notion of religion began with the Protestant Reformation and the age of imperialism. As European colonizers conquered and subjugated peoples in Africa, Asia, the Middle East, and the Americas, they saw the indigenous communities worshiping strange gods from their perspective, participating in weird rituals from their perspective, and believing in cosmologies that were very different than their own. Perhaps to distinguish their Christianity from what they saw, or as a rationale for exploitation, they called this heathen religion, treating them as organized systems when they were, in fact, simply ways of being in the world. Colonizers judged these heathen religions as inferior to Christianity and concluded that their practitioners were in need of Christianizing as well as civilizing. For similar reasons, including the disparagement of supernaturalism, many today, including some called nuns, spiritual but not religious, and bicoastal elites, feel the same way about Western religions. So what about those alleged nuns? As I said at the outset, everyone needs a reason to get up in the morning, which I consider their de facto religion. Ask scholars about this, and some have thoughts about the appearance of religion and spirituality in everyday life. I am sure most of you have heard of religion, lived religion, the way people's highest priorities are enacted in their daily behavior. If money is your religion, you probably gravitate to working in the financial sector, and you might even be in private equity. If sex is your priority, you likely spend a lot of time on Tinder, Grindr, or as I was researching this talk, there are some very esoteric apps for all kinds of specialized encounters. Yeah. Another way to see religion outside its institutional homes is through the lens of implicit religion. Implicit religion demands commitment and integrating foci, which is what gives one's life meaning, and intensive concerns with extensive effects. Intensive concerns with extensive effects, which translates as interests that require time and energy and have a significant influence over one's life. Sports is an implicit religion. So are fandoms. Think about Deadheads, Swifties, or Trekkies. But nuns don't need to be participating in an implicit religion to experience the interplay of the sacred and the spiritual. There are other gateways. Beyoncé's music opens listeners to the Orishas as well as Christianity, and also struggles around race and gender. Kendrick Lamar explores sin, temptation, God, and faith. John Coltrane's Love Supreme says it all with that title. And Bruce Springsteen has been preaching rock and roll revivals since the 70s. Likewise, many of our favorite movies and television shows explore themes of good versus evil, life after death, and the gray areas most of us inhabit. Of course, there are obvious ones like God Friended Me, which is really funny if you haven't seen it, and Good Omens. But there's also more subtle explorations such as The Wire, Breaking Bad, and more recently, Succession and White Lotus. Whether through social apps, online forums, or the old coffee klatch, discussing the themes in these shows and their embodiment by compelling character leads us to think through notions of meaning, identity, and purpose, which are the building blocks of religion and spirituality. So where does that lead us? How does it help you, journalists, on the hunt for a new religion story? Here's a few suggestions. Always interrogate surveys. Pew is not God, which I know because I worked there. Neither is NORC, Gallup, or even PRRI. I don't like quantitative research because it flattens reality and shapes it to a dubious model. For example, one of the markers of religiosity is going to church. Come on. I know a lot of people who go to church to meet a boyfriend, to meet a girlfriend, to meet a non-binary other. They go to church to impress their bosses. They go to church because their kids need friends. There are lots of reasons for going to church besides wanting to worship. Likewise, I know a lot of religious people who don't go to church. And here is one of my favorite examples, Ronald Reagan. When Reagan was president, the press corps decided that he was not religious because he never went to church, and all his religious language was basically for hoodwinking the Christians who voted for him. The truth of the matter is, and I know this from researching Reagan and reading his personal correspondence, he was a deeply, deeply religious man. One of the tragedies of his life was that his father-in-law, Loyal Davis, was not a Christian. And he wrote to Loyal telling him that he and Nancy, Reagan and Nancy, would miss Loyal in the hereafter because Loyal was going to be in hell if he didn't accept Jesus as his personal savior. That's not a verbatim, but it is the gist of the letter he wrote. So, yes, there are lots of ways to be religious besides going to church. Second suggestion is look beyond the obvious. Yes, the chosen and the faithful represent a new trend, and I can't tell you how many calls I've gotten about, is Hollywood getting religion? But that's the tip of the iceberg. The more interesting stories are ones like White Lotus and other shows that explore the idolatry of materialism. And I've yet to see a story about that. Faith talk, or religion on TikTok, is capital B big. AI, my new best friend, told me that it generates well over 1.2 trillion views globally and has, quote, fundamentally transformed how younger generations engage with spirituality, replacing formal, localized institutions with accessible, digital-first creators. This is not new, but there's lots to look into. And I think one thing we don't do as journalists, unless we're under the age of 30, is really take social media and what's happening on TikTok and other places seriously as the leading edge of religiosity going forward. There's obviously a big generation gap here, and one that I'm guessing most of us are over 30, and if you're not, wow, you're so lucky, are not paying enough attention to. And lastly, use the interpenetration of the secular and the spiritual as a starting point for finding stories, and begin by thinking about your own life. And here I'll wrap up with what I'm thinking about in my own life. I am a PI on a project about the spiritual infrastructure of the future. And when I know what that is, I promise to tell you all. I'm interested particularly these days in the future of American Judaism, when Zionism is no longer the center of our religious, political, and communal identity. Jews will need a new spiritual infrastructure and a lot of rethinking about our identity and our communal purpose. But really, really, that's true for every religion. Despite equating religion with words like tradition, stability, predictability, and consistency, religion is always innovating. First century Christians would be gobsmacked by the Vatican. 19th century evangelicals would be horrified by their 21st century right-wing counterparts. And Joseph Smith and his followers would probably be quite surprised by today's LDS. Religion needs to constantly adapt, innovate, and change if it is to survive. And the problem with living in history is that we often can't see that, and we often don't want to see that, because all the change is mind-boggling, and sometimes recognizing that and recognizing the instability of our own worlds is difficult, and religion seems to be a place where we can find constancy. And this leads me to my takeaways. Religion is dynamic, which is why it's so fascinating to cover. Always interrogate the easy answers that surveys provide. And I'll also say that theory provides. I'm not big on theories. I could probably argue that Weber's ideas about the iron cage and disenchantment have colored the way we all see the world and have made it difficult for us to see the interpenetration of the secular and the spiritual. I think there's a lot of enchantment going on all the time, and it's not just in Disneyland. But oftentimes we don't see it because we have Weber in the back of our minds, whether we realize it or not. And finally, try on new paradigms, starting with the interplay of the sacred and the secular in your own lives, in the lives of those you love, and in your communities. Thank you.
All right, so because we're going to flip to you, and because Richard mentioned the Holy Trinity of the Father, the Son, and President Roosevelt, and because Diane just referenced her own upbringing in New York, I've got one more story before we do turn to you, okay? And that's the story of a Jewish family who put their kid at Holy Trinity in Upper East Side of New York. And one day the father is picking up his son from school, and he says, "Hey, buddy, what'd you learn today? How was your day?" And the son says, "Well, actually, Dad, today we learned about the meaning of the school's name. Turns out Trinity means Father, Son, Holy Spirit." And the father pulls the car over to the side of the road, and he turns and faces his son in the back of the car, and he says, "Now you listen here, boy. You listen good. We're Jewish. There's only one God, and we don't believe in him." All right, first up is Sam Benson from Deseret News. Hit that button, Sam.
Thank you both so much. This is fascinating. I have a question for each of you. First, Dr. Parker, I'm curious when we do have the next, transformative president, how will we see it coming? Like, will there be signs of coalitions being built, or what should we be looking for? And then for you, Dr. Winston, I'm just curious to get a sneak peek of this spiritual infrastructure of the future project. If there's anything you can share on that front.
Please go.
Can I jump in?
Yep.
You've seen the next transformative president. It's Trump. He's built coalitions between groups that normally would not coalesce. I'm thinking about Muslims and the Christian right. I'm thinking about Latinos and white Wall Street folks. Trump has built those coalitions. He's offered a new ideology. He's made it acceptable to all these coalitions. The coalitions are there for different reasons, some for economic, some for political, some for the politics of resentment, but he's managed to keep them all. And I think one thing you didn't say, and perhaps this is not in the book, what's the author's name again?
Skowronek, Stephen Skowronek.
Skowronek. I think all these transformative presidencies have a religious coding to them.
Oh, absolutely.
Because you need religion to justify politics, even if you don't want to admit it. And so Trump has done that beautifully. So you may have a different answer about a transformative president.
I do. I don't think he's the transformer. I don't. I absolutely do not.
Well, you are more optimistic than I am, because I think we're in a 40-year cycle of.
I may just be more willful. I don't know whether I'm more optimistic, but we can work on that. So to go to your question, I don't think he is a transformer. I think the coalition is too unstable, and it's built around resentments rather than opportunity or hope. And that wears thin after time. He's also now involved himself in two wars that are not going very well for him. And politicians inevitably get in trouble with parts of their base because of that. And in addition, the price problem that's being generated by the price of oil hiked in the Gulf, combined with other forces that are acting to generate more and more inflation, also will lead to defections from this base. And you have to remember that he was elected in 2016 in no small part as a rejection of the order that Hillary Clinton represented, not what he, Donald Trump, represented, other than I'm not Hillary, right? And he wins last time in 24 because of Joe Biden in some very profound sense. What's happened is that we've had Democratic candidates who've in effect blocked the transformative moment. And I can talk about why that's so, but I just want to establish that. In terms of seeing when that transformer emerges, it's very, very difficult. You have to think of Franklin Roosevelt as having run for vice president earlier in the 20s, and no one would have recognized him as the father of the New Deal when he ran as vice president. His term in office as governor of New York was interesting, and certainly there were innovations going on, many of which were being pressed on him rather than led by him. And you know, he was when he ran in 32, he actually campaigned on a balanced budget, something that hasn't been heard much of in the last few years in the economy. I think what's going to happen is that more crises will emerge, out of which they will serve as crucibles for pushing forward candidates who are not yet on the scene.
I think that would be great, but I would argue, and I'm not sure I'm going to stick to it because I want to hear what you say to my argument, but
Give and take. Can you believe this? I can't.
I would argue that the market capitalism that has evolved since the Reagan presidency and its totalizing effect on society and culture has created a country that where Trump represents the apotheosis of these horrible beliefs. And that's part of the transformative moment, that we have become a country who worship the market.
If he and his key supporters were that confident of their popularity, they wouldn't need to be doing what they're doing in terms of redistricting, of voter registration, or or removal of mail-in ballots. Those are all measures that, to me, indicate fear, not confidence. So.
Yes, but if you look at the populations that voted for Reagan, many of them it was against their own economic interests.
Oh, yeah, I got that.
But because they all are beholden to this idea that money is the answer to everything, they did vote for him. And that was one of the reasons, because part of his persona is, look at me, the successful billionaire.
I think that's, again, I have a different read of a lot of Americans who see money as the ultimate defense tool, not as the ultimate goal. That they live in this condition of constant financial uncertainty. We have the evidence from the Fed studies that, 40% of American families don't even have an available $400 in their checking account if an emergency should arise, or that medical costs are the chief cause of of household bankruptcies nowadays, or that during the Great Recession, something like 8 or 9 million Americans lost their homes, and many more were scarred by their propinquity to those families that did lose. So I don't want to belabor this, but I don't think it's facts and figures. I think market capitalism has become our American religion. And I think that's the problem of our society today. We live in a world where our religion is based on how much you can get, how much you can consume, how much you have. And I think that's a spiritual problem of our time, which is driving our loneliness and driving our enslavement to screens, because our spiritual core has been so tainted by this. I don't disagree with you about some of the analysis. I disagree with you about it being novel. I think that it's been a characteristic feature of life in America since the colonial period, and I could sort of do some of that, so I'd push back on that. I would.
Other than that, no strong feelings. It's pretty good. Come for the nuns and stay for the sort of spiritual diagnosis of our market capitalism. All right, let's flip to Nina Shapiro at Seattle Times, please.
Okay, hi. So I have a couple questions, but I'm going to start with a big one.
This is good. I'm listening.
Okay, you both have talked about the meaning of religion for society, the history of religion. I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about the meaning of God and how that has perhaps changed over time and what people understand when they use that word. I noticed neither of you used that word, that Richard, you talked about the transcendent, and Diane, you talked about the higher power. What do people mean when they talk about that, and has that changed over time?
Well, I'm the economist, so the quantitative answer is Gallup asked the question, do you believe in the existence of God? And has asked it since the late 1940s. And up until about 8 or 10 years ago, it never went below 90% of the American people saying they believed in God, or at least that's what they told Gallup. Your turn.
So are you asking what I think about God or what I think people think
No,
about God?
I'm asking about what is meant by that term and how that has changed over history, and how perhaps people have different understandings of that term today.
Couldn't we just do since the Second World War instead of human history? That's a big chunk to bite off.
75 years. That's good. God changed the dynamic.
Tackle that in any way you want, but do you think that people have the same understanding of what that means?
No, I think that the idea of the transcendent or God or the ultimate deity has constantly been fluid. I mean, the existence in the from the outside, a lot of my students at the Kennedy School are international students who are trying to understand the role of religion in American life because they think that it's quite homogeneous and coherent because it's been 65 to 80% of Americans claim to be Christian. I go, look, first thing you got to do is look at a standard directory of denominations, and there are between 1,200 and 1,400 different denominations claiming membership of more than 10,000 members. That's not a cohesive, unified community. So the disparities or the varieties of belief that are sanctioned and codified within the theologies of denominations is wildly varied. And when you get down to the subjective level, wow, just the variety I think is quite great and fluid, changes with time.
From my perspective, and I would just look at this since the 60s, which is 60, 70 years of time. If I think about the social and cultural trends that have affected the country, feminism, women power, black power, brown power, gay power, I think all these different movements have changed the way we think about God. I think the women's movement has helped us think about God as feminine, which does have a history in most traditions, but it's been underplayed. I think black and brown power helped us think about God as other than, the white Jesus that has been so prevalent in many churches. I think the LGBTQI community has helped us think about, is God an entity that just loves particular kinds of persons, or is God inclusive of all kinds of people? So I think the cultural and social trends that swirl around us help shape how we think about God. And I think that in my lifetime, the ideas have really stretched out and embraced a lot of different kinds of diversity that I'm not sure how prevalent there were in earlier times.
Stephanie Tsai from PBS NewsHour.
I have two questions. One for Richard. I'm super curious to hear about your non-faith cycle. And unrelated to that, so Richard, non-faith cycle, if you can answer that question. And then my other question to both of you is, are American religious tendencies a current problem for the opposition? In other words, the Democrats. If religious coding is something that we see in transformative presidencies and perhaps in victorious presidencies, there might be many examples of that as well, including with President Biden and Barack Obama. Have the Democrats adequately acknowledged that in their strategy looking ahead to the next election?
My non-faith periods? First significant one would be from arrival at college through most of my 20s. And again, a lot of that was the rejection of or the differentiating of me from my father and my family. And it was also that I was in New England, 3,000 miles away from family, so there was no immediate impetus for going. In my mid-30s, I came back to regular worship because I had been in a state of crisis. I had a business that was very successful, but I had a marriage that wasn't, and that ultimately failed. I was drinking too much, which says a lot for an Episcopalian to admit to drinking too much. We're not Baptists. And I was jogging in New York on a Sunday and ended up hearing Episcopal hymns being sung. And it turned out, and I stopped and I looked around, and I was outside St. Mark's in the Bowery, which is this quite wonderful Episcopal church associated with the arts in the Lower East Side. To make a long story short, I ended up starting to attend St. Mark's in the Bowery. And just as I began to make that connection, the rector stopped a service for the portion called the Prayers of the People, where we pray for various. And there was a man in the front pew, and he asked the man to stand up, and he helped. And this was in the early 1980s. And he said, I don't remember his name, has AIDS. And he realizes that he's dying, and that he asks the blessing of the congregation on him as he prepares for death. And the rector said, for those of you who wish to come forward and lay hands on this person, I invite you to do that now. And every person in that church got up and went forward and laid hands. And I said, I want to be part of that community, right? We moved to, and then my Jewish wife and I got married in the National Cathedral, so that was its own kind of anchoring. And it hasn't persuaded my wife, but that's another story. And I started going to church again in Cambridge at this little church right across from the yard that started in the 1760s. And liked the rector very much, and got so involved that I joined the vestry, in fact, was senior warden for a period of time, and led a real, this is a very Episcopal, this may bore you. It had a large endowment, but the endowment was largely tied up in specific grants, many of which were given in the 19th century for like flowers. So we had an endowment with $800,000 in it for flowers. And the rector and I thought, no, doing social justice work is probably a better use of some of that $800,000. And so I carried on a 2-year battle as senior warden to get those trusts broken so that we could put them in a general pool. And we then co-financed something called Greater Boston Interfaith, which was is still this very interesting and important experiment in multi-denominational coalitions around issues like housing, education, et cetera, among other things. So that rector then left. We got a new rector who, for I don't know why, came from Mississippi, was high church, loved bells and smells and whistles, and loathed the idea of doing politics, and made the decision that he was going to close the church's restrooms to homeless people who relied on them in the square. I quit the church over that, and there is now and then led a 2-year effort by my students at the Kennedy School to get a public restroom constructed across the street from the church. You can see it today, a beautiful, expensive metal church. So as a consequence, I'm still not back at that church, and I worship occasionally privately at the monastery and a couple of other places.
That question was for you.
The larger structural query.
Yeah, Diane, my larger question was about whether the Democrats ignore at their peril the religious coding that seems very effective for the right side of the political spectrum in this country.
The Democrats know they are missing this coding. I think the problem is they can't figure out how to do it correctly. And there are individual Democrats, Warnock, Tallarico. Hillary tried to do it in her own way. Josh Shapiro is doing it. So I think that our Democratic candidates who realize the importance of undergirding your political message with a deep, true religious faith is important. If you believe the typical rap on Democrats, their inability to agree on most anything is going to prevent them from having a unifying.
Well, they're also much more
message.
polyglot, as you should emphasize. I mean, the Republican Party, if you look at the religious affiliation of members of the party, very different composition for the two parties. And part of the Democratic problem is that they can't hold those coalition members in a binding way together, because there are in fact people who are very angry about religion in different forms for a whole lot of reasons. So it's a
Right,
much
but-
more difficult coalition to hold.
But I think if you could say, yes, we agree on certain values, which they probably all do, people could then say, I come to those values through my
Absolutely,
Islam, my Muslim
right. Right.
beliefs, or I come to that through my humanist beliefs. The fact that they won't even like spend the time to set the groundwork of what those beliefs are, I think is problematic. There's something else I wanted to say about that. Yeah.
Go to Bill Barrow from the Associated Press, national politics reporter there.
Yeah, this actually builds on Stephanie's question in this same topic area. You know, of the 45 men who have been president, nearly all have explicitly identified as Christian, maybe an asterisk for Thomas Jefferson. 43 would be mainline Protestant, very few of them identifying as evangelical, even two Catholics. That's it. But we have J.B. Pritzker, Josh Shapiro, John Ossoff, you know, several other potential contenders in 2028. Less about them, more about this electorate that we have. Whether Trump's transformative or not, we clearly are in an era of flux where the coalitions are up for grabs. Do you see an American electorate, given the economic angst, the cultural angst, just everything up in the air, that would be willing to deviate from what we've done with choosing these 45 men that really look and sound the same in this realm? Is there an opening I mean, it would most likely be a Jewish president.
I've seen polls which say that Americans would support a Jewish president over a Muslim president or an atheist or agnostic. Those were a couple of years old. The problem with running a Jew for president now might be the whole question of Zionism in Israel. And even though young evangelicals are not necessarily in that pro-Zionist camp, there are enough older evangelicals who might react badly to a candidate who, you know, wants to distance himself from Israel. So I think that brings in a whole new level of problems that might not have existed if Gaza and Iran and the West Bank and a whole lot of other things hadn't happened that made the situation part of the news. I think it would be an interesting story, though, to talk to people about whether a Jewish candidate could succeed, because there are some very strong Jews, as you mentioned, who are in the mix now. I've myself believe that it would be hard to elect a Jew, but given the current choices, I don't know. I think Bernie Sanders somehow was electable because whether his Judaism, on the one hand, was so obvious in his cultural presentation, but so not there in any kind of religious way, he kind of didn't register as Jewish in a strange way, or he registered as so culturally Jewish, that was just who he was. And I think he would have had a good shot had he run against Trump. But he's sort of a, ad hominem politician.
Great. Let's go to Kalpana Jain from The Conversation, U.S.
Thank you both. This was a very illuminating discussion. So I have also two questions.
Use that
One
mic if
is-
you would, Kalpana.
Oh, I'm so sorry. So I also have two questions. And one is, I grew up in India, so I come with that identity. I'm also sort of finding, in all these discussions, I find myself in the minority faith, and understandably so, and finding that the framing of all this is Judeo-Christian. So when we talk about nuns, I'm hearing it more from that framing. So one question is that as we move forward, as the country is becoming more diverse, how are we incorporating all these, and you alluded to it, but I want to know more specifics about how are those beliefs being represented, reflected? Because when I hear you, this is not the religion I follow. There is no this specific divide. In Hinduism, traditionally, you could be an atheist and you could be religious, both at the same time. So there's a great deal of complexity, which I don't hear here. So I want to know more about, moving forward. How is this incorporated, or what are you finding, or what are you studying? That's one. And the other is, in my experience here, in my work here, there is a great deal of discomfort still with atheism as such. So we can say nuns, we can say non-faith, but atheism is still sort of, at least in my experience, there's a discomfort. So I want to hear from both of you about that. Their acceptance, also their involvement in public life and political life. Thank you.
I'll do atheism. Christopher Hitchens was my roommate at Oxford for 3 years.
Really?
So I was exposed to some of the arguments for atheism fairly well. I don't, again, I think you could save your filing paper costs running for public office if you plan to run on a platform of I'm an atheist, you're not. That's guaranteed. There are also wild variations by region. There's a diagonal that runs across the United States from the lower east, which is the most religious, to the northwest, which is the least religious. And it might well be that you could, en passant, mentioning that you are not a believer in traditional religious figures. There are ways of doing this. It's just that you can't do it centrally. But I don't know that there's a lot. I mean, hostility toward atheists in the Madeleine Murray O'Hair period was still about denying them housing or denying them jobs. I don't hear that anymore. I'm sure it's spoken, but it's not that America has gone away as best I can tell. So.
Well, I think a lot of Jews are atheists, so I don't think it's only Hindus who could be atheists but still practice a religion or a part of a culture.
I want to interrupt. And Unitarians, as a friend of mine said, are those who pray to whom it may concern. So.
Kalpana, I'm sorry, but I was asking Josh a question and I missed your first question. Could you summarize it?
Okay, if I can remember it. So I think one question was about atheism. The other was that even the framing around nuns is from a Judeo-Christian perspective. And as we
Why so? I mean, it says non-affiliation. You could be a Muslim nun or a Hindu nun or a Jain nun with the term. I don't understand that.
So the way I see it, it's more from an institutional perspective. Who's attending a church? Who's attending, maybe a mosque, but I don't know how far Muslims are included in that. How do you even study the Hindus or the Jains, for example, because it's not an institutional religion. So that's what I was trying to get at is, when you're looking at nuns, in fact, at least when I look at the studies of nuns, it's more about, well, these are people not attending church, but they are taking on all these other beliefs, or whether meditation, whether different other kinds of spirituality. So that's where all these other faiths go in. It's being adopted and adapted rather than being included in the study, is the way I see it.
I think the gist of my remarks are in agreement with what you're saying, that nuns is a specious category at best, and a wrong-headed one, because no one is a nun. Everybody participates in some sort of belief system, whether it's belief in Taylor Swift or...
I missed that service.
Although I might just add, as the moderator's privilege here, right, that the last Pew report suggests that of the 29% of Americans who are nuns, of that group, 64% calls himself nothing in particular. And 19% calls himself agnostic, and 17% calls himself atheist. So atheist is a pretty thin sliver, right, of the, quote, nuns.
Yeah, it hasn't hit double digits as far as I know anyplace.
I mean,
But I guess I would add, I mean, again, the idea, both of us dislike the idea of nuns. I'm a simpler thinker. I just think, would I refer to a woman as a not man? It just doesn't seem, it doesn't seem the right way to think about category of people who are doing what they're doing in the way that they're doing it, not that they're not doing it in the way that we think is acceptable.
I mean, this is why we both said that we don't like surveys, because they,
I distrust surveys.
well,
I can like what I distrust.
I distrust them. Wait, do you distrust them?
I distrust them.
Okay, maybe that's a better way of saying it, because they do impose these false categories that are very headline-worthy on ways of being in the world that are not truly accurate.
This is the Boston Globe's idea section a couple weeks ago. Religious faith is declining. So why are exorcists so busy?
Pay attention to Chris Smith. All right, so let's take a coffee break, and we'll come back and start with Daniel Strauss. We've got a few questions that are waiting. As I believe, coffee outside. There's certainly drinks in the back. Enjoy, and we'll resume in about 15 minutes or so. We'll pull you back in. All right, we've got questions from Daniel Strauss, who's a freelance journalist on the Hill, Annie Aguilar, Nina Shapiro, Yusra, others. So we'll get to you quickly, okay? So, but he's gone. So let's go to Annie Aguilar.
That works out for me. Diane, I was delighted when you were talking about deadheads. I live in Eugene, Oregon, where you could close your eyes, throw a dart, and hit a tribute to Jerry Garcia. But I'm curious how you've both seen these implicit religious figures that, in the case of the dead, very tied to a specific era, whether that half-life of ideological succession that Richard was talking about earlier. That's question one. And then question two, I was curious, outside of the slim list of transformative presidents that we were talking about earlier, how have non-transformative figures behaved in eras of social upheaval in relation to those coalitions?
Thanks, Annie. Those are good questions. I'm not sure that implicit religion is supposed to be an ongoing category like Christianity. I think it speaks more to a particular time and place where people find meaning in the cultural, social movements of their time. So being a deadhead probably won't be an important implicit religion in 100 years, though the dead may be stronger than I think. But I think it does speak to the current moment where people seek to find meaning, connection, community outside of traditional religious institutions.
Please, just use that mic.
You know, in talking earlier about money as an implicit religion, I was thinking of what Richard was saying of the kind of death throes of the Reaganistic era. Has that moral essence tied to that Reagan-specific push? You know, how has that changed as the market is still the dominant religion in America, as you were saying earlier? Just curious.
Whether money would be an implicit religion or a lived religion is something I would need to think about, though I guess you could make a case for either. I mean, that's the thing about being a scholar and being a journalist. You could make a case for anything as long as you can tell a good story around it. But money, I'm sorry, I got distracted of my own brain, yeah?
Don't we all? You know, we were talking earlier about that formation of religion as providing some sort of moral essence. And then we talk about either an implicit or lived religion, like money, like sex. Do those have key moral essences tied to those belief systems? And as we're at, you know, that kind of end, waiting for something more transformative from this Reagan era market capital, has that moral framework remained consistent in those decades, or has it shifted in notable ways?
That's an interesting question, and it's a question I think about a lot, since we are always reading about billionaires. And if you could argue that a billionaire's implicit or lived religion is money, what kind of moral essences are they tied to? It was interesting to me as a Californian because this came up a lot in discussions of Tom Steyer and whether or not you could trust a billionaire to be your governor. And I think that relates back to the question of if someone has dedicated their life to making money, as he did with his previous life, can they actually have moral claims beyond that? I tend to be a hopeful person and to believe in the possibility of change and growth. And so I would think that perhaps people who have made money the center of their lives could also hold moral commitments. I haven't seen a lot of reason to believe that recently, but I would like to think it's possible, which is why I would give Steyer the benefit of the doubt. I think that the capitalist machine has become a religion in America, and it is a religion that is a very jealous one, which is why I think there are ways in which traditional religions, institutional religions, seem downgraded today, because I think it's in the interest of the capitalist machine to get rid of any competition. And so religion is seen as superstition or outmoded or irrelevant, when I think we need religion more than ever today. The kind of religion that provides hope and moral grounding for people. That may be more than you asked for, but yeah.
If you want a book on the longer history of money and faith, you might take a look at The Enchantments of Mammon by
That's so
McCarhar.
great, yeah.
Yeah, I think that's a good read.
It's a very big read.
Yeah, it's a long book, but it's got a lot in it.
And I'd put in a plug for the moral rootedness of some billionaires, some of whom are on our board. All right, let's go to Yusra Farzan at LAist.
Sorry, I had a second question. as
Go
well.
for it, quick, let's go.
Outside of the slim list of transformative presidents you were talking about earlier, how have non-transformative presidents weathered these big eras of social upheaval in relation to those coalitions? It's hard to apply a generalized theme to all of American history, but curious if you see any striking themes.
Well, I mean, the answer is that, yeah, it's very hard to answer because there were different kinds of successors who played different roles depending on where they're positioned in the long cycle. But McKinley would be an example of someone who sought to be a transformer, died unexpectedly, and then created room for Teddy Roosevelt to actually take on a sort of a second-tier transformative relationship that would then get played out in his distant cousin, FDR, 30 years later. So, there are different possibilities with different presidents. Obama, in some sense, was meant to be, by the cycle, probably a transformative figure, but he was given the opportunity by the Great Recession that we lived through and didn't take advantage of it. So,
Do you think Garfield would have been transformative?
might have been. I mean, I don't know. That's a hard one to.
I mean, in the biographies I read about him, he does seem like he could and he
Yeah.
wanted to be.
Yeah.
How about Yusra Farzan at NPR?
Thank you so much. Really, really fascinating discussion. I have questions for both of you. Diane, for you, you said that you see Trump as a transformative president. How do you sort of explain also then the rise of like Zohran Mamdani in New York to sort of, he's like the antithesis of, all things Trump is, Muslim, openly Muslim, Hindu mom, 20-something years after 9/11, mayor of the city. How do you sort of explain his rise, in relation to Trump? And then to you, Richard, I think I want to understand maybe how transformative presidents work in a place like America where we also have transformative leaders. I would think Mamdani is a transformative leader. So how do they sort of work in relation to local, state leaders, these transformational presidents, if they're sort of, in cahoots, not cahoots, but in sort of with odds against each other.
Like Roosevelt and LaGuardia,
Yeah,
you're thinking
yeah,
of? Okay,
yeah.
Okay, go ahead. I didn't want to.
I should say Yusra was my student, and she is always trying to like push me. That's a good student
And a good journalist.
and a good journalist. I don't think having a transformative president negates the possibility of having other transformative kinds of leaders. And so Mamdani represents another side of transformation. And the fact that New York, where he was elected, probably did not go overwhelmingly for Trump in the last election might explain why he was transformative, why someone like Mamdani could be elected in the Trump era. Obviously, Mamdani could not have been elected in the Deep South, where Trump found much support, or in many of the Rust Belt states where Trump also had a lot of support. So I think part of it is just situational. Richard pointed out why Trump might not be transformative, and I hope he's correct, but even if he isn't transformative in the long run, I think he has had some transformative effects on the country in the short run, which we will live with for a while. Sure. So, and he had more of those than many other presidents I could think
also
of
true.
in,
Sure.
in recent history. So it gives me new hope to think that he won't be transforming for the next 40 or 50 years.
Good. Well, I'm glad that I could share some sense of hope with you.
Thank you.
You want to touch yours too, Richard? No, happy.
I'm sorry?
Wasn't there a flag for you?
So you wanted to talk about the relationship between presidents and mayors or presidents. So in all of these periods, you see activity going on below the presidential level, whether it's in the colonial period before we actually have a president, or in periods like the run-up to the Jeffersonian presidency that starts in 1800, or the formation of party politics at the state level and the creation of functioning Democratic Party under Jackson, or the impact of the Know-Nothing Party on the Whig Party and part of the way that the Whigs were destroyed and made room for the Republicans. There are lots of examples. Wisconsin, for progressives, the role that Wisconsin played, for example, in pioneering a lot of programs at the beginning of the 20th century that then were picked up by FDR is another example. So that's always going on because politics is taking place at three different levels, and it's just within state institutions, and it's taking place in religion. That's part of my very comfortable. You can't be an Episcopalian and realize that the Anglican Church was the political decision of Henry VIII to break with the Pope, and then of American Anglicans to break with the Church of England, and say that there's no connection between religion and politics. The very institutional life of my church is dependent on political decisions by political actors. So, and I can go thousands of more examples of other traditions as well too. Does that get it, some of what, or am I missing something?
Yes, but I think I'm also trying to sort of understand then, are presidential leaders actually transformational then, if this is sort of happening on a micro level, like on a state level or local level?
When you say actually transformational on a micro level, what does it mean? If Roosevelt can install Social Security and it makes micro payments to all retired Americans or 90% of retired Americans, that's micro level as far as I'm concerned.
Yes, but I'm going to use Trump as an example that I know you don't think of him as like a transformational leader, but some of his, his policies will have far-reaching effects, but then there's also these other leaders who are sort of enacting policy that is countering some of the things that he's trying to do. Yeah.
But do you find that problematic?
Yeah, I don't
No,
understand.
no. I think I'm just trying to understand.
That's an important observation, but
Yeah.
with all due respect, I think it's a second-tier observation. I was trying to establish the core claim that there are these long presidential cycles that Skowronek has identified, and within them there are certain patterns. Absolutely, there's politics going on at the state and local level throughout this period, and those state and local actions and actors are always something that have to be incorporated into the president and his successors in terms of their governance. And it's part of the way that the cycles deteriorate. They're not just attacked by opposition party presidents, they're attacked or modified or renewed at the state and local level. Right?
I like that.
Is that okay?
Yes.
Thank you.
Christian Paz with Vox Media.
Hi, thank you guys for this wonderful conversation. I have two quick questions. The first is for Richard. Is there a connection between these periods of transformation and transformational leaders and the great religious awakenings that we've lived through in the US? And if so, are we living at the tail end of one? Are we living through one right now? The second is what the effect of new atheists, you mentioned Hitchens, have had on the nuns. And this is for both. Whether there is, what the rise of new atheism caused the rise of nuns eventually, whether new atheists were replaced by the nuns that we talk about today, and whether the posture of these nuns, atheists, agnostics has changed recently from this hostile freedom from religion kind of posture from toward closer to the 2000s, and the position of nuns today, which seems to be redefining religion and a decline in atheism, perhaps, and a replacement by this none of the above.
Wow, that's a long list. So specifically with the Great Awakenings, with the 1730s and 40s, that's one where we're in a colonial era. There's some complex ways to answer that. The second is at the end of the 18th and beginning of the 19th century, and it's pretty clear to me that you're going to see there the earliest seeds of abolition, of suffrage, and of prohibition all emerging. You get the very first sort of institutional expressions of those, and they're part of this whole benevolent society model that the Presbyterians lead in, but are joined by the Congregationalists and others, where, again, because you have a society in which the intermediating institutions between government and the populace is so thin, and also because traditionally welfare provision had been pushed through the churches in England, so or in Europe, and so the precedent was set there for that. In a world in which you had no established church, the impulse of church leaders or members to try to begin to engage in the provision of social welfare or of social reform is going to aim much more at government because they don't have a place of their own through which to push it. So does that help at all sort of get, is religion relevant to other periods in politics? Well, I don't know. I would look at the Christian right in the 1980s and 90s and tell you are all, at least as children, you would have encountered the consequences of mobilizing one of the major political groups, which are the white evangelicals, to shift in a historic way from the Democratic to the Republican Party. And what it had gave us Bill Clinton, because that shift gave us the DLC, which in turn gave us Bill Clinton. So, is that,
someone asked earlier about spiritual infrastructure of my project. We are just at the beginning, but if you are familiar with the Imminent Frame, the SSRC blog, there's articles by several of us on spiritual innovation. I would recommend mine to you because mine makes the case that you cannot think about spiritual innovation without thinking about the political and cultural circumstances of the time. Mm-hmm. So the Second Great Awakening happened in tandem with the Jacksonian Revolution. And both of them were basically about the same things, about individual autonomy, about the common man, about individual agency. Mm-hmm. And it's hard to say which influenced, both influenced each other, but what's the chicken and what's the egg? I don't know if there is a chicken and egg. I think there is a zeitgeist often that moves in ways that affect all our systems, and religion and politics are among them. And again, I think you can see that in the 80s with Reagan, because many people say that what the SBC went through with its conservative turn was a dry run for the Republican takeover. And if so, there were Republicans who were helping the SBC leaders with that conservative takeover because the strategy basically was the same. And as a reporter in the 1980s, I was in the South, and many of my conservative Christian sources said, very frankly, we will be taking over the country. And we're taking it over step by step, county by county. And at the time, most of us thought that was nuts, but it was. It was a religious and a political change working in tandem. So to me, it would seem that transformative political changes often are coinciding with transformative religious changes. And I think that's because there are currents of a certain time that work in tandem to create new momentums. Does that make sense?
I always told my students, never make an argument to me that is monocausal and unidirectional. I will hand you the paper back and make you do it again. So.
I think I remember submitting a paper like that, and it was a real disappointment. I would just add quickly, Christian, I think that's a really lovely question, and there was a presentation about a year ago out here by Molly Worthen about charisma, her new book, Charisma, where she profiles, Joseph Smith. She also profiles, I think it's, Jonathan Edwards and George Whitefield in The First Awakening, talks about Charles Finney, Dwight L. Moody, eventually Second Awakening, the Third Awakening, Billy Graham, Dwight L. Moody. I think I said that wrong, but Dwight L. Moody was part of the third, right? Finney was part of the second. But anyway, she goes into some of them, and the idea of a conversation that is happening in our politics is definitely part of the story, just like the conversation that's happening in our filmmaking is part of the story, just like our conversation with Silicon Valley is part of the story. But the religious conversation, she talks about it a little bit in her lovely book, and I would commend that short conversation to you. Let's go, if we can, to Dominic Gates with the Seattle Times.
Hi. I begin by saying that anytime anyone in this room says the word nuns, I get this cultural dissonance. I used to teach in a school where the principal was a nun, Sister Immaculata. My question is for Diane, and it's about my struggle with the word spiritual. Nina asked to define God, and I'd like you to define spiritual because, I'm no longer a Catholic, and when I became an atheist, there would be frequently I'd see people saying, well, I'm not religious, but I'm spiritual. And I always thought that seemed really wishy-washy. I didn't know what they meant. It seemed like what they meant was I don't go to church. I'm not a member of an established church, but I have a moral code. I try to love people, whatever. And I always thought to myself, well, I have a moral code. I try to live a good life. I get up in the morning, I have a purpose, and I don't need religion for it. So I always struggled with this word spiritual. It seemed to me empty. Now, you described yourself as totally secular in your upbringing. So I'm interested how you define spiritual, and if you say you're spiritual today.
I totally agree with you, and I wish we could invent new words for both religion and spiritual, because both of them have become so enmeshed in conversations that kind of pull their meaning apart that it's hard to know what either of them means. And they both have such problematic connotations that they're hard to use in a neutral sense, right? And I totally agree with how you feel about spiritual, and it's one of the things that has made me cautious about using the word, because spirituality has become another victim of the kind of capitalist religion that I was talking about. I can't remember the book's name, but there's a book written about how spirituality has become a total part of consumer culture. I think recently, though, in my classes, I talk about spirituality. I try to ignore that side of spirituality, and I talk about it as the catalyzing moment of revelation for people the catalyzing moment of revelation when people are seeking something transcendent. And so I believe all institutional religions begin in spirituality and then through a process become codified, reified, ritualized, and become religions. But I believe that spirituality is the beating heart of what we call religion, because it is the individual, authentic experience of something beyond oneself that also may be deeply inside oneself. So that is how I choose to think about spirituality. And I can't ignore the other ways it is used, but I'm choosing to use it in that way. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, I think the big distinction you made there was.
Hit that button, Dominic, if you would. Hit that button.
I think the big distinction, good distinction you made there was recognizing something beyond yourself versus perhaps being inside yourself. And
Well, yeah, I think spirituality leads you both to a transcendence and to immanence. Some people more one than the other, but the immanence is the awareness of your link to the transcendent, right? So, yes. And that way, it becomes very clear to me how to distinguish spirituality and religion, because, again, one is the experience and one is the institution.
okay. Thank you.
Barbara Bradley Haggerty from The Atlantic.
This is really fun. Thank you for being here. And I admire your skepticism, your distrust of polls. I want to preface this question by saying that I have actually two questions, like everyone here, apparently. The first question is, what is going on with young men in religion, young men in faith or whatever, and kind of getting into that. Is there any evidence other than anecdotal to suggest that young men are gravitating toward a kind of Trump masculinity type of religion? Or, like Lauren had a terrific episode on The Daily where she profiled actually a man who was liberal and atheist and found he needed spirituality, not kind of masculinity. So that's the first part. What's going on with young men? The other is, I think, really aimed at Diane. When you think about new modes of religion, and you mentioned TikTok or whatever, I think about the epidemic of loneliness. And I think about one thing that a lot of people are doing that I see is going back to church for community. So I'm wondering if, like, social media religion is actually sustainable, or if it will actually, solve the problems that of loneliness and meaning and purpose that people often go back to church for.
Great.
That's a great question. Do you want to talk about young men?
Yeah, the most recent is that I'd point you to is a Ryan Berg article. It's probably a couple weeks old that goes into the difference between the GSS and the CES polling and the likelihood that this jump is a statistical artifact having to do with the way the poll questions were asked. So before we declare victory, I think we need to look at the polls. It's a good it sounds, from the Berg article that I scanned, it's a good example of why you should be cautious about sweeping statements based on polling data. So, is that?
But is there a phenomenon of young
dislike,
people
just
going?
skeptical.
I feel like I do see people gravitating back toward church, young people. I mean, I see it in my own church. So I'm just wondering, is that like a myth, or is it, or do we see anecdotal evidence? You don't capture it in polling, perhaps, but except as an artifact.
Data is the plural of anecdote. That's what data is at times. It's very hard to say. I mean, that's the problem. It's very, very hard to say, and how durable, if there is a bump going on and its size. So I tend to be quite patient about these kinds of questions, thinking that more will come and will become clearer, but to not, I mean, journalists are under this daily deadline demand or psychosis, depending on which you want to call it. And there's a rush to judgment in that preliminary draft of history that itself one has to stand back from and gauge cautiously. So I would argue that Berg has a good short article on just some of the technical problems with the poll data that's being used for this narrative. And then it's just a question of standing back and waiting another couple of years to see how this one's going to cook out. So.
I agree, but I also think that, you know, you can write a story about anything and find anecdotes and probably even data to support it. I agree with you insofar as anecdotally, I see a lot of younger people showing up at religious-oriented things that I hadn't seen before, and partly because a lot of new things are using language to attract them that older things aren't. So for example, I went to a Shabbat service at a synagogue that defines itself as non-Zionist. And there's a new network of those, you can't call them synagogue, they're like, you know, groups, you know, that meet. And I think that they are attracting some young people who have not been interested in traditional Judaism because these young people are anti-Zionist. So I think when you can change or innovate your religion to speak to people in the current moment, people will come to that, right? So I do think there is a lot of interest in doing exactly that. Stephanie Spellers, do you know her? I mean, her work with young people in the church is another good example of
Sure.
that. Stephanie Spellers is at St. Bartholomew's in New York City. She's an Episcopal canon there. And she has done a lot of work going around the country talking to young people about what they are looking for, what they believe and what they're looking for. And she's been really successful about bringing young people to church. Someone told me a story, was it you recently, about a church where people weren't coming to Sunday services because their kids had lots of activities, so they changed their meetings to Wednesday night. And all
Right, that's the problem with the sports Sunday. As the father of 2 hockey players, I face that continually, right?
So by just changing to Wednesday night, they were getting young people and young families to come. So I believe there is a recognition among many religious institutions that we need to think about changing in order to reach more people. So I do think what you're saying is correct, but I'm not sure it's for any other reasons than people being smarter about how to get the message out. I remember 20 years ago when people began experimenting online with virtual religion in Second City and so on. There was a big argument among religion scholars. Does this mean all religion is going to go online and real churches and synagogues are going to die? And what people eventually saw was that virtuality contributed something, but it didn't replace the real thing. And I would imagine that's true for social and TikTok now, that it may bring people together, it may help people explore ideas, it may help people understand what they're really thinking or realize other people think it too. But at some point, most people want to interact with real people. So maybe that will be another way to bring real people back into spiritual or religious communities. So yeah, I think it's great because it's a way for younger people to feel comfortable with these ideas and discussing what they think and what they feel and trying to turn other people onto it. But ultimately, I'm not sure you can create a community, even if you're an influencer with 1 million people. People want to talk to other people, so.
Great. I'll just say super quickly, Barb, from our desk, we got a couple calls from like Alan Cooperman, Ryan, Christian Smith, who are like demographers and experts in the space. And the basic refrain was, come on, like there's these stories that are one-offs about how this particular church had an influx of a bunch of people who became Catholic right before Easter. That's great, but we just don't see it in the national data yet, so we're skeptical, color me skeptical. And that's been a pretty common line. On the other hand, like there are some strange, trends. The tech bros turn toward religion. Peter Thiel, people he backs to run. So like there's something going on. There's something going on that's burbling. It seems like Daniel Strauss at Capitol Hill.
Sorry about earlier. Reporting called. So forgive me if this has been covered already, and this is somewhat of a prompt for discussion and a question, but of the last 3 presidents, 2 of them have had what we could casually call almost a messianic following or sort of cultish following, Obama and Trump. And they both, visibly kind of came out of nowhere, which follows sort of stories of Christianity and Jesus that we're very used to for a while. And the view among their supporters is that they would come and save everything. Obama, early in the 2008 campaign, was nicknamed by the press the One, for instance. And Charlie Kirk liked to compare Trump to Samson. And I guess I'm just wondering, if you guys think, I'm a campaign reporter, if you guys think that view that the standard bearer for the party is gonna be seen in sort of similar lights going forward. So not just a revolutionary, but someone who almost could, or we casually joke, can walk on water in some way. And just finally on this, what I'll say from covering campaigns for more than a decade is, it's really about faith. I mean, it really is. When you don't know how a candidate is going to behave once they're elected. So it's a lot about support and hope and communities and being part of some sort of energy. So I just wanted to throw that out there, and that's why I'm announcing my campaign for president.
It's coming to me?
Do you want to take it first?
Yeah. Which one was the first about the?
No, I mean, do you want to go first and I can go second?
No, you go first. Sorry.
Historically, there's a reason that religion and governance have been tied together. And that's because if you want people to follow you, you need to give them a good reason. And I think that helps explain the divine right of kings and why for so long a period of time, at least in the West, your temporal leader was also a spiritual leader. And that was actually true in Muslim communities for a long time. Am I right, you, sir? Thinking of the caliphate and so on? It's hard to take orders from someone who if you don't think they're on a higher plane than you are. And it's hard to believe in someone to lead you if you don't think they're somehow getting special wisdom. So what we did here, what the founding fathers did by divorcing religion and politics was even a greater experiment, I think, than we give it credit for being. And I think it's not surprising that the religious right keeps wanting us to have a Christian government, because they want to have some sense that we are living in concert with what they feel is God's laws. However, I think, well, not however, and I also think that helps explain why candidates often invoke religiosity to propel their campaigns forward and to get more followers, and why some politicians like Obama, like Trump, to some extent like Roosevelt, are able to successfully portray themselves as people of faith, if not people of deep religion. It's interesting to me what's going to happen going forward, because I imagine Trump's religiosity has left a bad taste in many voters' minds. And the fact that it's been taken to the point where he depicts himself as Jesus, you know, healing the sick, turns off people. So this is totally hypothetical, and we'll know if I'm right or wrong in 2 years. But I would imagine religion might play a slightly different role going forward in the 28 campaign than it has in the past, because people are going to be sensitive to what a religious president might feel capable of doing or right in deciding, like Trump, basically. You know, I'm God's man, so everything I do you can trust. Well, obviously not. So on the one hand, I think you're right. We do look for those candidates who can give us enough belief in their own religiosity that we can trust them. But I think Trump has sort of stretched that really thin.
I'd sort of answer it in similar ways, although I'd take your precaution earlier about using the term religion or spirituality. The way I work, the way my mind works is I hear the word religion, I immediately want to go, which religion, which large which large school or block, and then within the school, what time period and where, before I can even formulate an idea of how I want to answer the question. So it's hard for me to sort of think about what religion's impact will be on politics going forward, but I can sit and we could take the time to do, well, what about evangelicals? And I would also use this as an opportunity to say the many newspaper and magazine articles in the 80s used to drive me wild because they would talk about evangelicals without any differentiation between the politics of white evangelicals, black evangelicals, brown evangelicals, Asian evangelicals. And it was just intellectual carelessness that was just crazy. And it was used by people like Falwell to claim, well, 40% of Americans are evangelical. Well, that was true, but barely half of those were white evangelicals, so that the numbers were completely different and created a different perception of politics. And more writers should have been more careful about using terminology. I'm a great believer in helping people graph or map the traditions in the United States and affix to them as traditions general positions on the Democrat-Republican split or on the liberal-conservative split. They've got enough information. I certainly wouldn't treat it as holy writ, but it would really help journalists to be sure that they understood what was going on in that sense.
Can I take the two-question privilege and follow up here? Just as a also comment.
That's a third question.
Thank you. You went to Harvard, didn't you? I just want to close my presence with a comment here, which is like, you go to the Lincoln Memorial, you go to the Jefferson Memorial, these look like temples. And I'm not saying that this is, the way we as Americans approach our government in a lot of ways feels like similar behavior to a religion. And I'm not saying that's good or bad. I'm a big fan for the power and the usefulness of myths and legends. I just want to throw that out there to the crowd here. Like, it's Trump or not, this is part of the way we behave.
I would take that that would be a starting point for me, which is I always thought that what was brought to New England was this narrative of a new chosen people and a new covenant being created out of the Protestantism that was arising in the 16th century. And you know, the Thanksgiving story is a story that was launched in the middle of what? The Civil War. And what you want to understand is before that, Americans didn't formally celebrate Thanksgiving, but Lincoln was persuaded to declare a day of Thanksgiving as part of managing popular emotions around the frustrations of the war, and that Roosevelt was brilliant in the ways that he would simplify religious concepts, but always put forward as one of the four freedoms: freedom of religion, freedom of religion, freedom of religion. But it was never freedom for a particular denomination or for simple Christianity or simple Judeo-Christianity to be given that position.
But what you're talking about sounds a lot like what Bella called civil religion. And, you know, Bella and other writers have written about the way the 4th of July is a religious holiday, the way that Lincoln and Washington are American saints. These monuments, you know, Jefferson and Lincoln are like temples. So I think what you're saying dovetails with what I was saying before about the need for humans to invest some sort of sanctity in their government. And what you're describing is how we do it.
Well, Trump, part of what you guys are talking about the transformative, and I know that word makes us uncomfortable because it sounds too positive, but he really is upending that sort of respect and that pattern of service first. I mean, this state is home to the Huntsmans who continue to believe, I think, McKay, that like you serve in government regardless of party as best you can. And Trump has transformed that away from that way of behaving.
Well,
No, absolutely.
that is a good story. The way that Trump is ending the civil religion that has united us for so long, that's a good story.
I'll pitch it to the Atlantic.
Good idea. Yeah, just really quick, as is the tale that Sachs used to tell about those memorials, right? That you go to a memorial here, FDR, you've got these described descriptions about the 4 freedoms, at Jefferson, Lincoln, you've got ideas on marble, second inaugural, you've got the description of the toleration, and you go to the similar museum in statue rather in the UK, and you have one word, right? Churchill. You have one word. That, Margaret That, 2 words. That, right? Something about the idea differentiation here was ideally the anchor, right? Which is just different than a lot of other countries. Think about political leaders, political leadership, American covenant. All right, Carl Cannon, Real Clear Politics, executive editor from Washington, D.C.
Diane, you talked about that the love of money is maybe one manifestation, one type of religion. And, you know, I was thinking about that because actually in the Bible, it says that the love of money is a sin, not a religion, as you know. But I guess I don't know any billionaires personally, and I don't know the people on Josh's board he's referring to, but I want to take a moment to stick up for billionaires, and I'm going to make a couple of comments and both of you respond. Richard, I know you'll have some, maybe even disagreement, but, you know, I don't think Americans love billionaires. I think most Americans, I'm talking about not scholars, just most Americans are willing to accept billionaires as the cost of an economic and governing system that allows for creative entrepreneurship. And, you know, Democrats loved Elon Musk, loved him before he threw in his lot with Trump. And they loved him because of the car that they later defaced because of global warming. There was a consensus in this country in the 1970s that government deregulation was stifling the economy and was stifling innovation and therefore stifling the economy. And this move towards deregulation, which began when Jimmy Carter was president, was a consensus of both parties. Democrats passed these laws, Carter signed them. And it escalated, of course, when Reagan was president. It lasted, it's still going on, I guess, but maybe it got to, you know, the apotheosis was when Bill Clinton, you know, signed a law repealing Glass-Steagall. I just remember I thought maybe we've gone too far with this. But the idea was this was aimed at the middle class and opening opportunity. You know, millions of Americans were able to fly on airplanes before you'd had to have money to do that. And that was the theory behind it. And you know, I'm thinking, Diane, in response to what you say about some of these, you know, the capitalism, I don't think Americans venerate capitalism the way you guys are talking about. I think they accept it as, to paraphrase Churchill, the best system of all, because all the systems are terrible, you know. And Arthur Brooks makes the point, and other people have made the point, that free market capitalism is the highest moral system because it's the system that has demonstrated the ability to bring hundreds of millions of people out of poverty in Africa and elsewhere, and that it's the most moral system. And so when I think of free market capitalism, I think of it in a different way than you're talking about. I don't think people really love money in this country. And I think in this sense that Trump is I don't think he's the logical extension. I think he's a sui generis. I think he's an obscene example of where, I don't think Trump gets this, but I think the American people do.
Thank you. My mother said, if you can't say something nice, don't say anything at all. So what I would say is I appreciate hearing that. It's something that I'm familiar with as an argument. It goes to the core of where we think religious values are located in this country, as well as political values. And it's, it's an old wheezer of an argument. I mean, we've been going back and forth on the limited government argument my entire life. And over the course of the 20th century, government share of the total GDP grew from 4% to 40%. And while we've seen a slowing of growth, most economists would agree that that's about the maturing of the economy in a number of ways, not the size and presence of government. And so, I just hate to have to do these things in terms of government, no government, or free markets are free and governments are socialism. It feels backward looking, right? And I'm not saying—
Richard, I'm not making an economic argument. I'm making a theological argument. What I'm postulating, I could be wrong, is that Americans have that free market capitalism fits into Americans' moral framework. And that does not justify the excesses of it or the attempts to rein it in and to control it. And to
I think look, there's a much larger question about the reconciliation of individual and collective responsibility and opportunity and mutuality that is going to go on. I have seen no philosophic resolution of it that satisfies me. And so I remain a skeptic of capitalism as I do capitalism's putative alternatives. I think that, again, to answer the question what most Americans believe would require a lot of conversation with a lot of Americans, because in my experience, it has been a kind of fluid state. I mean, you know as well as I do that in the last 3 or 4 years, there are more young people who say they're in favor of socialism than they are capitalism. I dare say they can't define either one of them, but it's indicative of something, which is a story about the fluidity of people's beliefs based on their calculation of what's happening to them, what's happening to their community, what's happening to their nation as a whole, and that fluidity is what we should be paying attention to, and whether or not from a moral point of view or a religious point of view, there is in fact a continuous improvement of the life circumstances of as many people as possible. And in that context, I would say a global dimension, not a national dimension, is sufficient, is necessary. Does that sort of come back at you in a good way?
I'd also add that there are different kinds of capitalism, and Roosevelt—
Short, tall, blue, red, yeah.
I think Roosevelt tried to institute a welfare capitalism where within the capitalist system, people would be taken care of if they needed help or assistance. What we saw with Reagan in the 80s was the putative end of welfare capitalism and the beginning of a more intensive market capitalism or neoliberalism.
It was welfare capitalism, but just for a different class. I mean, really, I would be very strong about that.
That's a really good point. So I think that kind of capitalism that we've been living with for the last 40 years is very different. And you know the numbers as well as I do. Maybe in the 60s or 70s, a boss made 200 times more than his employees. Now they make 2,000 times more. I mean, those kind of inequities are the inequities I'm talking about as the problems of capitalism. I don't mean to say Americans love money. That's a bad shorthand for what I believe. But I do believe Americans think that personal satisfaction and their personal satisfaction is somehow tied to getting, owning, consuming. I think we live in a society where all the message is coming to us many of the messages coming to us from media tell us if we bought this makeup, if we got this bra, if we bought this house, if we had this speedboat, these things are going to make us whole. And they're never going to make us whole. And when I talk about the religion of capitalism, I'm not talking about a love of money. I'm talking about a misguided belief that wholeness and some sort of transcendence can come from anywhere but a personal commitment to spending time understanding that the world is an amazing, beautiful place, and that the real things that are necessary for us to thrive are already here for us, and that no matter what car we drive is not going to make us happy. Is that a better?
Thank you both.
It's great. It's great. Let's take a closing question before we break for lunch from Mitchell Atuncio at Sojourners. So we're going from Real Clear Politics and the Case for Capitalism over to Mitchell. Let's see what happens.
Well, thank you both. I have a journalism question, and it's how do we report on these things this way? We're talking about whether it's money or sex or Taylor Swift or Kendrick Lamar, treating it as if it's like it's an industry of which there are adherents, and that in some way makes it religious in nature for them. I shouldn't know how to report it that way, especially when they don't self-identify that way, and someone might identify in multiple ways. They might be a rich Catholic who's a Taylor Swift fan. Are they multi-religious? And Diane, I guess the question is specifically, where have you seen this done well, and when have you seen this done poorly? Like, what does that look like when it's done well versus done poorly?
For journalists who are complicating the narrative.
Yeah. I think this kind of journalism is not daily journalism, and it's barely even featured journalism. It's more long form. And I think these things can be teased out in long form when you're able to put a character front and center and then weave in the various influences and ideas that shape that character. I teach so much of this that it's hard to think of one specific example, but speaking from my own journalism, I did a piece a while ago about a Black woman entrepreneur from Oakland who's a committed Buddhist, and she decided to move to Louisiana and begin a farming initiative to help Black farmers grow rice in a sustainable, environmentally correct way. So I had the Black woman entrepreneur, I had the Buddhist angle, I had the Black farmer angle, and I had the kind of fish out of water. This was someone from Oakland, from LA, from New York, who was going into rural Louisiana, which was a totally different environment. And I think because I had the space to tell that story, I was able to make her a compelling character, but also weave in what Buddhism meant to her and why it was not just a religious or spiritual commitment, it was also a commitment to do good in the world. And through that, I was able to talk about the problem Black farmers are facing in this country and why farming rice in traditional ways made more sense than doing it in the agribusiness way. So I do think you can get complexity in stories. I think you need about 2,500 words or 5 minutes to 10 minutes of an audio piece to do it. So does that help?
Just 3 books by journalists. One is Out West by Dayton Duncan, in which he took his VW van after the failure of the Mondale campaign, because he was press officer for the Mondale campaign, loaded a case of Maker's Mark in the van, and then proceeded to follow the Lewis and Clark Trail all the way to Oregon, and narrated what he was seeing with what was in the journals. And it's a beautiful rendition of the contrast. There are two books by Ian Fraser. One is Family, and the other is The Great Plains. And Ian is one of the New Yorker's most skilled writers. I really admire the work. And Family is about his family in small town Ohio. And it is a recollection of where his family came from, how they had lived in earlier times fighting for the Union in the Civil War, but also talking contemporaneously about what it is that he loved about America. And it's a very elegantly done. Great Plains will do similar. Another would be American Ramble by Neil King. Am I getting that right? Neil King Jr. Yeah, Neil King Jr., which is a beautiful, beautiful book of a journalist, former Wall Street Journal foreign editor, was it?
He passed away.
And yeah, and he died of cancer. I knew him, and he walks from Washington to New York City on the back roads. And what he discovers there about America is a quite beautiful thing. And I think trying to get into the heads of writers, and then I'm missing one, I just skipped over one. Trying to get into the heads of writers like that who are themselves also journalists would help you, not just with story framing, but voice, I think, even though I'm not encouraging you to do book-length articles every month, right? Does that answer, Mitchell, some of it? Just a little, something's not being answered. How do I do short form, Mr. Parker? What's your question? No.
I think rooting journalism in people's experiences is kind of key to this, because one person's experience can touch other people in a way that, like, a whole lot of stuff, a whole lot of interviewees can't.
Mm-hmm.
And unfortunately, the way the industry is now, we're often not allowed to have the time and space to do that well. But that's the best way, I think, to get at complicated ideas.
I wish John McPhee wrote more openly about religion in the way that he approaches nature. So, yeah.
All right, we covered a lot of territory this morning, friends. Thank you, Richard Parker. Thank you, Diane Winston.